BBC One and iPlayer.
Northern Ireland begin their World Cup qualifying campaign with an away match in Italy. We'll have match highlights over on BBC Two Northern Ireland tonight at 10:30.
As the First Minister tells the Secretary of State to back off over abortion services, the Deputy First Minister says the Executive must act. But can it break the deadlock? We'll hear from both sides and ask Sinn Féin and the DUP how damaging this latest row is for devolution. That's The View tonight, 10:45 on BBC One Northern Ireland.
And a very good evening from BBC One Northern Ireland. We're now at 10 o'clock, the BBC News with Hugh Edwards and Joe Scott.
Tonight at 10, MPs vote to extend wide-ranging coronavirus powers for another 6 months amid warnings cases may rise again. Learning to live with the virus, landlords say plans for vaccine passports to enter pubs are unworkable.
I think it will drive people away from the local hospitality venues and even city centre ones, where what we need to be doing is bringing people back in.
Also on the programme, strong words from Brussels after EU leaders met for talks tonight. AstraZeneca must catch up on vaccine deliveries for the EU before exporting elsewhere, says the President of the EU Commission. Contaminated blood, the biggest treatment disaster in NHS history. Campaigners welcome government plans to review possible compensation. A teacher at a school in West Yorkshire is suspended after showing their class a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad. On a night of World Cup qualifiers for 3 home nations, England get their campaign underway with a resounding victory over San Marino.
These are the hands that touch us first. Feel your head.
And a year after the first clap for carers, the author Michael Rosen, who nearly died from COVID, reads his poem to thank the NHS.
And in Northern Ireland, the First Minister warns the Secretary of State to back off over the issue of providing abortion services. And there's frustration from the local travel industry over mixed messages about summer holidays.
Good evening. MPs have voted to extend emergency coronavirus powers in England until September, despite a large rebellion by backbench Conservative MPs against the plan. The government has refused to rule out extending the wide-ranging powers in October. The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, told the Commons he expected people would continue to wear masks long after restrictions are lifted, and warned cases could rise again. Plans for so-called vaccine passports were raised by the Prime Minister yesterday to allow people back into pubs and other hospitality and entertainment venues. Today, Boris Johnson said the idea might only be viable once everybody in the UK had been offered a vaccine. Here's our political editor, Laura Kunsberg.
Eager to get to the bar? Forget proving your age. What about proving you've had a jab or a negative test to get a pint? The Bell and Cross near Stourbridge has already spent thousands to get ready to serve outside.
I just think it's a really, really bad idea. The checks we had to do anyway when we were open were extensive. It created a huge amount of extra work, which meant an extra increase in the staff costs, also the stress of the staff, because we were meticulous in following these instructions. Where are we going here?
Boris Johnson paints himself a freedom lover, but regular COVID checks are being considered as the government wrestles with how to safely open the economy. It's not easy to grab on to straightforward solutions.
You need to get a haircut.
And are you booked in for April the 12th?
For the pub, yes.
No, for the haircut.
Whether haircuts or this issue, pub passports, there's a lot to plan.
You've got to be careful about how you do this, and you might need to. You might only be able to implement a thoroughgoing vaccination passport scheme, even if you wanted such a thing, in the context of when absolutely everybody had been offered a vaccine. So there are complexities, moral complexities, ethical problems that need to be addressed.
Hang on though, this was only last month.
What I don't think we will have in this country is, as it were, vaccination passports to allow you to go to, say, the pub.
That view is shifting though. This is one of Downing Street's locals, and like everywhere else around the country, it hasn't seen a punter for months. The government isn't planning to make vaccines compulsory or force you to do a test every time you leave the house. But they are looking at how pubs, restaurants, venues, football grounds or workplaces could use COVID checks to help open up and let us back in.
Officials are considering if pubs and venues could stop social distancing if they carried out COVID checks, but they'd leave the decision to do so up to individual firms.
It's not really for the government to abdicate its responsibility and leave it to the private sector to decide the rules and then take the flak for, what may be very unpopular decisions.
With so many doors still shut, this suggestion's riled a small but noisy group of Tory MPs, already unhappy that ministers asked them to extend the government's sweeping powers.
Unless you fight for freedoms every day, they end up being taken away from you.
After months of denial, now indeed it will be the case that you will have to provide your vaccination bona fides when you go to the pub.
We, as Conservatives, should be very careful not to constrain the private sector in how they choose what customers they have.
COVID checks wouldn't be used until everyone has been offered a vaccine and won't affect grand plans to reopen outdoor venues next month. But as restrictions roll back, one thing is clear, the world won't look the same. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
The head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has said tonight that AstraZeneca must catch up on vaccine deliveries for the EU before exporting its vaccine supplies elsewhere. European leaders have been meeting this evening to discuss tightening export controls on vaccines. The French President, Emmanuel Macron, said all exports should be blocked when drug companies don't respect their contracts. From Brussels, here's our Europe editor, Katya Adler.
Prague is remembering its dead. Simply, painfully, with one of the highest COVID fatality rates in the world. The Czech Republic, like many other EU countries, is in the grip of a third wave. Vaccines are in short supply. National rollout, like here in Belgium, in disrepute. The EU's credibility on the line. EU leaders have been meeting remotely today to discuss how to secure the EU's vaccine supply, ensuring companies deliver jabs promised, and controversially, potentially blocking vaccine exports to vaccine-producing countries like the UK, which have an already advanced rollout.
We want to make sure that Europe gets its fair share of vaccines, because we must be able to explain to our citizens that if companies export their vaccines to the whole world, it is because they are fully honoring their commitments and it does not risk security of supply in the European Union.
What started as a health crisis now has political overtones here, especially after Brexit. EU leaders are under huge pressure to act. Their voters increasingly frustrated about a lack of vaccines and fearful because of a third wave of the virus. But not all of those leaders want vaccine export controls. Tonight, the Commission is trying to persuade them otherwise. It says since December, the EU has exported 77 million jabs to wealthy countries, 20 million to the UK, I've just been told, without receiving one back in return. Intentionally provocative, perhaps, the Commission now insists Brussels was key in making the UK's vaccine effort a success. Some EU countries say they prefer never to use vaccine export controls for fear of disturbing international relations or supply chains. France is more hardline. But today, President Macron admitted the EU had made mistakes along the way.
We didn't go fast enough, strong enough. It's absolutely true. We thought the vaccine would take time, but we are catching up.
Not a moment too soon for Europeans languishing in lockdown, decimating their economies. Sophie, it's a two-day summit, but proceedings have now wrapped up for the night. And what have we learnt? Well, that EU leaders have supported the Commission in wanting to expand powers over controls over vaccine exports leaving the bloc. in theory, but in practice, what we're actually hearing from a lot of member states, like the Netherlands, for example, is they want to make it very difficult to actually use those controls because they want to safeguard international relations and global supply chains. Good news for the UK. The UK relies on the EU, Sophie, for the Pfizer vaccine, so it didn't want those exports blocked. And another piece of good news in EU-UK relations, we're being told tonight that possibly as soon as this weekend, there could be some agreement between the two sides of how to better cooperate on vaccines going forward.
Katya Adler, thank you. The latest government figures show there were 6,397 new coronavirus infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period, which means on average 5,489 new cases were reported per day in the last week. The latest figures show 5,122 people were in hospital across the UK. 63 deaths were reported in the latest 24-hour period. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. On average, in the past week, 74 deaths were announced every day. The total number who have died is now 126,445. As for vaccinations, more than 330,000 people have had their first dose of a COVID vaccine in the latest 24-hour period, bringing the total to just under 29 million people, and almost 2.8 million people have now had both doses of the vaccine. Campaigners calling for compensation for people affected by contaminated blood transfusions in the 1970s and 80s have given a cautious welcome to government plans to review the matter. Up to 30,000 people were infected and thousands died as a result. It's been called the biggest treatment disaster in NHS history, and so far there's been no government compensation, just limited financial support. Here's our health editor, Hugh Pym.
Jason Evans watches home videos to remember the father he barely knew. He was just 4 when his dad Jonathan died after being infected with HIV and hepatitis C as a result of treatment for his haemophilia. He's been campaigning to get to the truth of what happened and for the government to pay compensation.
These are demonstrable losses that have occurred. People couldn't get life insurance. People lost their homes. They lost their careers. My own mum was sacked from her job based on the fact that it was known that my dad had AIDS. So there are real losses here that have occurred before we even talk about the emotional damage, the physical damage.
A public inquiry into what's been called the worst disaster in NHS history is underway. Inquiry staff have been trawling through hundreds of thousands of pages of official documents. At the hearings, those who'd lost loved ones were encouraged to leave notes in bottles. More than 3,000 people died after they were treated with contaminated blood products, some of which were imported using blood from paid donors, including prisoners. Victims and their families do get financial assistance, but campaigners say today marks a big change, with the government for the first time saying that compensation could be paid, depending on the outcome of the inquiry.
The government have never previously acknowledged liability for this. They've always paid this money on the basis that it was support payments rather than compensation. And so they've never actually acknowledged their liability and said that they're responsible for this. So just the word and the recognition that comes with that word compensation is hugely significant for our community.
The inquiry chair, Sir Brian Langstaff, had said that it was unfair that the UK's 4 nations were paying out different levels of financial support. Today he welcomed a new commitment to get those national schemes up to the same level. Claire Walton's husband Brian died with HIV and hepatitis C after being treated with contaminated blood products. Claire, who gave evidence at the inquiry, said today marked a step forward.
I was 23 years old when this started, and I'll be 60 this year. Being turned from a wife into a carer, from a wife into a widow, and it would be good just to see the end, and that's what compensation means to me.
But families of those who died know there have been false dawns before. For certainty, they'll have to await the findings of the inquiry next year. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
£95 million is to be spent improving maternity care in England. The money from NHS England will be used to recruit hundreds of midwives and dozens of consultants, and is in response to the maternity scandal at the Shrewsbury and Telford NHS Trust. The move has been welcomed by bereaved parents as a step in the right direction. President Biden has held his first news conference as President of the United States. The 78-year-old said he expected to run again in 2024. Mr. Biden announced a doubling of his vaccination target in his first 100 days to 200 million doses and defended his policies on immigration and gun control. Here's our North America editor, John Sopel.
No fanfare, no hail to the chief, no fight with journalists.
Please sit down, thank you.
No one even called another beauty. This was about as different from the Trump era as you could get, though the memory was there.
My predecessor. Oh, God, I miss him.
He wanted to parade achievements, the speeding up of vaccine delivery, the boost to the economy from his stimulus package, and a new tone for political debate.
The third reason I said I was running was to unite the country. And generically speaking, all of you said, no, you can't do that. Well, I've not been able to unite the Congress, but I've been uniting the country.
But on the southern border, his problems are growing as quickly as the number of immigrants trying to cross into the US is swelling. The first real test for the president.
The idea that I'm going to say, which I would never do, if an unaccompanied child ends up at the border, we're just going to let him starve to death and stay on the other side. No previous administration did that either, except Trump. I'm not going to do it.
He's also talking tough over gun crime, where in the last week there have been 2 terrible mass shootings. But what can he do? Not much, it would seem, given the votes in Congress. And that means on these big issues, he could look weak. Abroad, he said that North Korea was still the biggest problem.
But I'm also prepared for some form of diplomacy, but it has to be conditioned upon the end result of denuclearization.
There would be no big changes on China policy.
Doesn't have a Democratic with a small d bone in his body, but he's a smart guy.
And would he be going along with Donald Trump's timetable for getting American troops out of Afghanistan?
We will leave. The question is when we leave.
Sorry, do you believe, though, it's possible we could have troops there next year?
I can't picture that being the case.
This news conference, in terms of style, represented a complete break with the Donald Trump era. But in terms of substance, say it quietly, not so much. On policies like the border, globalization, China, Afghanistan, it was all quite similar. It may not have been full-throated America first, but there were strong hints of it. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
A teacher at a school in West Yorkshire has been suspended after showing a class a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad. The start of the day at Batley Grammar was delayed as some parents staged a protest outside. The head teacher has apologised. Tonight, the Department for Education said it was never acceptable to threaten or intimidate teachers and said that schools should be free to include a full range of issues, ideas and materials in their curriculum. Shabnam Mahmood reports.
Videos posted online show an angry protest this morning outside a school in Batley. Parents calling for the sacking of a teacher who used an image of the Prophet Muhammad during a school lesson. By lunchtime, the teacher in question had been suspended, pending an independent formal investigation.
The school unequivocally apologises for using a totally inappropriate image in a recent religious studies lesson. It should not have been used. The member of staff has also relayed their most sincere apologies.
Showing the image has offended the Muslim community. Batley Grammar School is in a town with a high number of Asian families. According to a 2015 Ofsted report, 3/4 of its pupils come from ethnic minorities. People I've spoken to outside the school say they're shocked by what's happened.
Overall, it's offensive. Whether it was, like I said, a family member, a friend, a teacher, it's offensive. The issue has been raised and flagged and dealt with. It should be laid to bed now.
Tonight, the Department of Education has issued a statement urging parents not to protest and said it is never acceptable to threaten or intimidate teachers. They said schools are free to include a full range of issues, ideas and material in their curriculum, including where they are challenging or controversial, subject to their obligations to ensure political balance. They must balance this with the need to promote respect and tolerance between people of different faiths and beliefs. Community leaders here say although they are hurt by what happened, they will continue to work closely to resolve the issue. Shabna Mahmood, BBC News, Batley.
Nike and H&M are among major clothing retailers facing a backlash in China after expressing concern about allegations that Uyghurs are being used as forced labour in the production of cotton. The retailers who made the statements last year have found themselves at the centre of a growing row after sanctions were imposed on Chinese officials by the UK and other Western countries this week. It's estimated that nearly 1 million, mostly Muslim Uyghurs, are detained in camps in the northwest region of Xinjiang. BBC investigations have gathered first-hand testimony of forced labour and allegations that detainees have been raped and tortured. China denies the claims and says the camps are vocational training schools. Our World Affairs editor John Simpson reports.
The stories about the Uyghur camps have spread around the world after reports of forced labour in the cotton fields of Xinjiang province. International companies like H&M and Nike have all reacted strongly, and that's brought an angry backlash from China, which says the accusations about the Uyghurs are lies. Today, in the Turkish capital, Ankara, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has come to talk to President Erdogan. There were protests by Uyghur exiles. Turkey has strong ethnic and cultural links to the Uyghurs, and it's always given them refuge. A Uyghur woman, Nurisman Abu Rashid, who went to Turkey to study, recently found that her entire family back in Xinjiang had been arrested, father, mother and 2 brothers.
When I asked them why, and they said my family members think they might have an intention to attend terrorist activities.
12 years ago, when China clamped down on rioting among the Uyghurs, the Turkish leader Recep Erdogan called it genocide. It's not a word he'd use today. China is pressurizing Turkey to ratify an extradition treaty, which would mean handing over any Uyghurs China wants returned.
China is just far too powerful economically, and too many trade deals all came with terms and conditions.
So, effectively, China's bought off Turkey.
Yeah, just like all the other countries, many Arab countries and Muslim countries like Pakistan, and they're not speaking up at all.
Turkey's economy has suffered badly from COVID, which has brought a collapse in tourism, its biggest foreign currency earner. And since the West isn't doing much to help, Mr. Erdogan has turned to China, which offers Turkey everything from COVID vaccines to weapons. The Turkish embassy hasn't replied to our questions about this. The fact is, Turkey's really up against it. It's got its serious economic problems, and it's moving away from its old friends in the West. China's only too happy to step in, but part of the price for that would be to keep quiet about the Uyghurs.
I really want to see them again. I'm not sure if I can or not. They spent their whole life to offer me a good education, to have a good life.
There's no shortage of stories like this, but Turkey doesn't seem to complain about them publicly anymore. John Simpson, BBC News.
The banking group Santander is to close 111 branches in the UK by the end of the summer. The firm says it will also move its headquarters out of London to Milton Keynes in Buckinghamshire. Around 800 staff will be affected by the closures. The government says it's looking at all options to make sure the UK's third largest steelmaker, Liberty Steel, does not collapse. Concerns have grown for the company, which employs 5,000 people after its main financial backer went into administration early this month. Our business editor Simon Jack reports.
Rotherham, one of the 12 towns and cities around the UK facing a new crisis in the steel industry. They're all part of an industrial empire facing financial ruin.
Well, Rotherham's a steel town. It's recognised as a steel town.
Chris Williamson has worked there for 26 years, his father before him for 40. He explained what the impact would be on Rotherham if the plant closed.
It'd be devastating. Rotherham would suffer vastly. What other jobs is they're going at the minute? What pay? If we go to Wayside, as the chains go as well, in the end you just end up with a town full of shopkeepers and nobody to buy anything because they haven't got the income.
Down the road is Rotherham's sister plant in Stocksbridge. Tracy runs a cafe right outside the gates and she counts generations of workers among her customers.
Right from the young apprentices, which is actually trained here, all the way through to the retirees that have worked here all their lives. It's actually the beating heart of the valley.
This crisis started a long way from Tracy's cafe. Sanjeev Gupta, once hailed the saviour of steel, was using tomorrow's money to pay today's bills by selling invoices due for future payment to a company run by this Australian sugarcane farmer turned banker, Lex Greensill, who would buy those invoices at a discount for ready cash. But Greensill went bust. Claims have since emerged that former Prime Minister and Greensill employee David Cameron personally lobbied the Chancellor on Greensill's behalf. This is a sadly familiar story. Once again, a major UK steelmaker finds itself in big financial trouble. Its one-time saviour, Sanjeev Gupta, who bought this plant and plants right across the UK, has essentially run out of cash. Remember, it was only 18 months ago that the government had to intervene to keep British Steel going. Once again, it finds itself having to dust off plans to intervene in an industry it insists the UK still needs. The UK will need plenty of steel for transport and energy projects, so beyond another rescue, what could longer-term government support look like?
That could mean supporting the industry through procurement, the same as the French government, through energy prices, the same as the German government do, but finding a way to help the industry to compete on a level playing field with other industries.
Liberty may yet succeed in finding a new backer, but cash is tight and it started asking customers to pay up front. The government insists it wants to buy more steel from British producers. Its first job may be keeping one of them in business. Simon Jack, BBC News.
The salvage company hired to free the huge container